Grandpa.
This is Gail Morgan
yeah.
welcoming you to the Libertarian Counterpoint. Now, your host, James Just.
And thank you all for joining us. We want to welcome John and Richard back today. It's been an interesting week in the news. Gavin Newsom and the legislature are trying to change the rules right in the middle of the game again. It's on top of that, we've also got Gavin Newsom getting caught, shall we say, misrepresenting how much work in the wildfires he's been doing. You've got these two kind of bizarre issues going on here in California this week. We've got Gavin Newsom, who has essentially lied because his unions tried to back him up and saying, "Oh, it's a miscommunication." I'm sorry, you can't miscommunicate by that much.
Yeah, John's got a lot to say about that, so I'm going to make my comment very short, to the point, and terse. Gavin Newsom is a politician. His mouth was open.
Go ahead, John.
I'm actually shocked because Richard was terse and to the point. Usually it takes him 300-400 more words than that. But Gavin lies about lots of stuff. But the fire issue, I don't have the numbers. I should have looked them up before the show. Gavin managed to get a whole bunch of money to fight fires in the state of California. And the idea was that they were going to implement programs to prevent forest fires. And so what they actually did was hired a bunch of firefighting people who are all union employees who make great wages, who give him lots of money to get reelected. Whereas fire prevention would have been clearing forests and education, basically helping.
John, let me give you help with the numbers here for a second. Yeah. He overstated it by 690%. He claimed 90,000 acres had been cleared and treated, but the actual numbers were 11,000. Ad pops up. 11,390.
Yeah. Well,
so it's not like he just rounded up.
That's just the most recent number, but he got literally billions of dollars, and instead of spending it on fire prevention, which fire prevention doesn't need to be done by union laborers who retire after 20 years of quote unquote work, making $100,000 a year plus. Fire prevention can be done by all these out of work loggers we have, because the idea of that is not. Controlled burns are one thing, and you probably should have somebody monitoring a controlled burn. But what people in private industry do to prevent fires is they make sure that forests aren't overgrown and underbrush is cleared and there's not a lot of fuel on the ground. So what Gavin has done is hired a whole bunch of people he's done a little bit of controlled burns, and controlled burns are just one part of fire prevention, and hired a whole bunch of people to fight the fires that are going to happen because they didn't do what they should have done. And there's probably, what is there, 140 million dead trees after this next round of dry summer. There's probably going to be 150 million dead trees in forests in California. And if you want to prevent fires, you don't have a bunch of firefighters waiting to put out the fire after it starts, because all of that fuel there is remove those things. And those loggers I'm willing to bet a lot of them would work at break even to do that, because they make their living from the woods because they love the woods, just like farmers make their living from the land because they love the land. And watching this mismanagement and the lies associated with this mismanagement is pretty disgusting. And I think that's really all I got to say.
Yeah, it's not just a little exaggeration where you kind of round up and that type of thing, which is kind of normal. A little bit of hyperbole. It's 690%. It's 90,000 versus 11,000.
And that 90,000
we have to watch the calendar.
Should have been 1 million. That at this point, with all that money, there should be 1 million acres that have been taken care of either through thinning of forests or controlled burns. And so it's even worse. Go ahead, Richard.
And the outset is there will be a difficult fire season this year, almost for sure. And Gavin Newsom predictably wants to move the election up before the fire season begins. I wonder why that might be.
And before the fire season and before the rolling blackouts that they pretty much guaranteed to happen, because it's nothing like having your air conditioning go out because you can't run it. If you have any power at all, you're going to keep your very expensive food because of government caused inflation from defrosting in your freezer. And then if you got a backyard to move into, you're going to move into your backyard because you can't stay cool in your house. But then you're going to be choking on the smoke from the fires burning. So there's going to be an awful lot of upset voters, and hopefully enough of them will be upset enough to get rid of this clown. And we're going to, I think one of the topics is the failure of lockdowns. So
yeah, that one's coming up next. I just want to say one more thing about this changing of the rules. This is the second time in 4 years they've changed the rules to help one of their Democrat Party members. This is the second time they're trying to do it. And which is part of the problem is that, we can chop the head off, we can chop off Newsom, but the dragon still exists. The legislature and the Senate and all the stuff that actually operates the state government still exists. And so, it's a good symbolic move, and I'm happy to vote against Newsom and get him out of there because he's a lying politician. I'll use a different slur.
Oxymoron, lying politician. Yeah.
Man. But I'm wondering exactly how much good it's going to do in the long term. Anyway, and as we discussed, in a new paper, economists from the University of Southern California and the RAND Corporation examined the effectiveness of the pandemic lockdowns using data from the United States and 43 other countries, and they found out that it's actually had a negative impact on death rates, not a positive impact. And essentially, they've been useless. At best, they're
worse than useless. And
we were saying that a year ago, or more than a year ago. We were saying that the increase in suicides, the increase in drug abuse, the increase in alcoholism, the increase in deaths due to not being able to get admitted to the hospital for cancer screenings and other preventive medical procedures, all of those would increase the death rate more than any perceived change in the coronavirus death rate being lowered. And there's a lot of evidence that shows that there was not even a lowering in the coronavirus COVID death rate. So the whole thing is something that we predicted. And it's interesting. It's a situation where we gave to government willingly, for the most part, not you and I, the three of us, but most people gave to government the collective responsibility for fighting this deadly quote unquote virus. We gave up our own personal responsibility for not getting the virus, which would include quarantining if we were in the at-risk group with comorbidities or too old or whatever. It included the responsibility for making sure that we wore masks or socially distanced when we thought it was appropriate, not 100% of the time, no matter where you are. And we gave up the ability to decide whether we were safer inside versus outside. And it's almost a foregone conclusion that we're safer outside, where the virus will blow away, than inside, where it won't. And we gave up all that stuff to the collective responsibility of government. Individual responsibility equates with liberty. Collective responsibility correlates with tyranny. That's the bottom line. That's what we need to remember.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And one of the things that was mentioned in passing in the article, which I think is the most despicable outcome, is that, the liberals claim to care, and those who are in favor of big government claim to care about other people, which is why they insist upon taking money from people who created it and giving it to other people to make them better off. But the people that were hurt worst in the world, and some in the United States, but most in third world countries, are children, and who were pushed into the lowest level of poverty. You didn't even mention, Richard, one of the other outcomes is the hole in the earning ability of students who've lost a year and a half and will never make that up because their schools weren't open, because they are government schools. Don't want to call them public schools. And so that's been horrible. But the real crying shame to about this whole mess to me is that poor people throughout the world, because of the economic crunch, over 100 million of them, at last count it's probably 200 million now, were pushed into the lowest form of poverty. Many of those are children, and many of them will flat out die. Way more of them will die than people died from the coronavirus. And that's the big shame. And that's not, I still don't think that's talked about by enough people loudly enough. These people who supposedly care about others obviously didn't care about the most vulnerable people on the planet. And that's what really makes me upset.
I don't know if anybody's done it yet, but I would guess that if somebody ran a correlation between governments that are autocratic, tyrannical, and government shutdowns, there would be a very, very steep positive correlation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
We didn't have the one thing that, we're supposed to be in fact famous for is balance. We're supposed to balance the needs of, basic human rights versus public health versus the fact that, we know we're going to be wrong. Mm. When we have these, put all our eggs in one basket, and you're just increasing the likelihood that we're going to be wrong and the consequences of that. I know someone who had a motorcycle accident and didn't go to the hospital because they were afraid of catching coronavirus. They'd rather get an infection from the road rash and all the various other stuff than go to the hospital and get treated because they were afraid of coronavirus. We installed that much fear in people that they were willing to not get treated for a serious incident because out of fear of something else. It's mind-boggling that we actually deliberately did this.
Yeah,
and how many people are going to actually get away with it?
Well, and the other thing that not the article itself, but one of the comments that we passed for our thousands of people who watch this show on a regular basis, we pass articles around to do research before we talk about this stuff, is that if any logical person would look at this situation and ask themselves the question, why did governments do this? Why did these people take 100 years of pretty good public health knowledge and throw it out the window over this virus? And the only rational conclusion you can come to is that it was a power grab. It was a power grab that happened at some especially precarious timing prior to a major election in this country. And I'm not saying that was the reason, but that was certainly one of the outcomes, the outcome of that election.
Well, I'll go there. I'll say that was the reason.
Okay. All right. And then I'm not a big believer in conspiracies because, these people can't.
It's not letting a good crisis go to waste.
Yeah.
Well,
is that wrong, Manuel? Didn't he say that? Yeah. And so this crisis then allowed people who wouldn't have been in power without the crisis to ram through a bunch of easy spending socialist / liberal stuff, re-regulate the world, hand out money to their friends. The governments caused the economic fallout because of these lockdowns and closing businesses. And then the states that were most affected were the ones that were most locked down. And they were also amazingly the ones that voted the most for this power change. Without New York and California, the other party would be in power. Maybe not any better off, but I think the handling of this whole situation has been better. And so that bailout mostly helps out those political entities that supported this change in power. And so I absolutely agree with Richard that this isn't being talked about. Certainly the reason. Because if you'd have followed public health science, less of this stuff would have happened. And they protected the most vulnerable people like they did in the past. And then herd immunity would have gone through, and they made it very hard to develop vaccines so that the lockdowns that they implemented lasted even longer than they should have. So on.
Still going on. Still going on in some places.
Yeah.
Well,
and then
I'm not willing to rule out. Yeah, I'm not willing to rule out panic and incompetence, and then the grifters come in. Yeah, in Australia, I just read this morning, Australia is now locking down their cities because, of course, they don't have any herd immunity because they've been locking down. You have to let the dang thing spread in order to get past it. It's kind of the bizarre consequence of the whole thing. It's
either everybody needs to get vaccinated, and or enough people need to catch have natural immunity afterwards. And all the tests that are being done now indicate that once you have caught even a mild version of the fluvid or the COVID, whatever you want to call it, one of the publications I read calls it the CCP virus, Chinese Communist Chinese Party virus. And that would certainly be a wonderful opportunity for a rant in the future. There, the people who caused this are blaming everybody else, and what comes around goes around. Everybody was talking about the lab thing being a fantasy, and Now, surprisingly, it's coming out of the lab. But we did that. We do this to ourselves by letting these people take and hold power. And the only way to not have this kind of a horror happen again is to remove power from these people, because they're going to take it and hold it. And some programs that they've implemented during this grab are going to last for years. They'll be on the books for years. And what did Newsom say? Your favorite person, James, said that he's not going to eliminate the state of emergency in California until the virus is eradicated. And the virus is never going to be eradicated.
Yeah, it does.
Therefore, we're always going to live under a state of emergency.
Which is kind of defeats the purpose. A state of emergency is a short-term issue, not long-term how life is. If it becomes part of normal life, it's part of normal life, and you deal with it through the normal political process, not through states of emergency. But you talked about going to court. We're going to go ahead and move on. The Supreme Court has struck a big, this is a big blow here, but I think it's a big win for property rights, actually, against the union's invasion. You call it a union invasion against unions essentially coming onto a private business, interrupting their operations so they can give a sales pitch. That's never made any sense to me. Unions are just businesses. They sell a service to employees, and since when can you just, any business, have the government say, yeah, you have to let this guy come on and give you a sales pitch for 3 hours every 2 weeks or whatever it is. It's an absurd concept.
3 hours a day access. State of California law, but the Supreme Court said it was unconstitutional, which is a wonderful thing. And I think Richard probably has something to say about it, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I would say that this is a good thing, and it's the result of some diligent lawyers at the Pacific Legal Foundation working for many years. This case has been working its way through the lower courts and the appellate courts for at least 5 or 6 years now.
I think it started in the initial activity that got the ball rolling was in 2015.
Okay, so 6 years.
6 years it took to get it to the Supreme Court.
Get it to the Supreme Court, and it's just very, very fundamental. If you have the right to own property, and theoretically we have property owning rights in the United States, then you have the right to exclude whoever you want from your property. It's your property. You want to exclude somebody, you can. Doesn't make any difference whether they're wearing a union label or not.
Yeah, and this kind of dovetails into another case. There was a Janus decision a while back that curtailed union power pretty significantly. People were supposed to have the right to opt out of paying union dues. And the state of California, of course, the day the Supreme Court decision came down, ran through a piece of legislation they had sitting on the desk that gave the unions all sorts of nefarious ways to keep people from opting out of paying dues to unions that don't have their best interests at heart. Unions that choose to support oppressive government, and one to I think it's like 93 or 94% of union support goes to Democratic or even further left candidates, because they all believe in unions and they love that union money. And another example of union overreach being supported by the government, and still. The state of California law states that the employer can't tell a public employee who is a member of a union about their rights, that information has to come from the union. So it's a crazy pro-union world we live in, and despite all of that, union membership is shrinking by huge numbers every year.
In the private sector, but not in the public sector. What a surprise.
Yeah.
Well, it doesn't
Well,
surprise me.
Yeah,
That
and
is shrinking.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt flat out said that there shouldn't be any public employee unions, but because he understood the consolidation of power that would take place from that, and basically he was a socialist. So what the heck? I don't think they had public employee unions in Nazi Germany. I'm not sure. Anyway,
Well, the modern union doesn't actually represent the individuals. And we learned this during the gig worker fight, AB 5 and Prop 22, is the unions never came to the gig workers and asked, what are your problems and how can we help you? It's just, here, we say you have these problems and here's your solution. And they never, anytime we said, well, that's not what we want, here's what we want, they say, those are just corporate talking points. Well, they're corporate talking points because we told them that's what we want. And, these things, this isn't a either or issue. We know that we wanted freedom and flexibility instead of, extra benefits. Because for us, benefits are changed. For gig workers, benefits are changed. We don't want to be tied that closely to the people who give us cash. We want to have a quick and easy economic exchange. I perform tasks, you give me cash. And that's it. It's the only connection we want. And, they've taken that away from us in many respects.
Yeah.
So in another one, here, the George has ordered the FBI to halt the forfeiture of cash and jewelry from a safety deposit box. There was an issue, I think, in Southern California where the FBI had a search warrant, and the search warrant expressly said you can't search the safety deposit boxes, and they took them and searched them anyway.
You can't seize the stuff in the safety deposit boxes, and they certainly did that. And I think there was a limited search. Correct me if I'm wrong, Richard and James, because I probably am. The search warrant was extremely limited, and and as you said, James, spelled out specifically that the assets couldn't be seized under forfeiture rules.
I think it's interesting.
For a specific thing. Yeah.
The interesting thing about this case is this was a private safety deposit box company. If you have a safety deposit box at a bank, the government can come in without any pretext whatsoever and take whatever, open the safety deposit box and do whatever they will with it. That was proven really, really strongly during the FDR administration, when people were legally able to own gold bullion, and stored it in safety deposit boxes. Roosevelt, by executive order, made that illegal, and within weeks or months, everybody had to have their safety deposit box open with a federal agent in attendance to make sure that that any gold that was in the safety deposit box was confiscated. And I think it was $23 an ounce. Shortly after that, Roosevelt raised the price to $35 an ounce, thereby confiscating a huge part of the wealth of ordinary Americans that trusted, actually were silly enough to trust banks and trust their government. The Los Angeles safety deposit box system was not owned by a bank, which theoretically gave it an added layer of protection, but the FBI ignored those layers of protection and seized all of the assets anyway. Now a judge has ruled that not to be kosher. We'll see how far that goes on appeal.
So my question with all this is how come we can have these agents of the government routinely violate laws, constitutions, have judges, issue orders that, you've violated laws and constitutions, and yet none of these constitutional rights, and yet they're never held actually accountable?
Well, it's because the pretext for taking all of these assets, stealing money from the people, whether it's civil asset forfeiture or just cleaning out safe deposit box, the pretext is that this money is ill-gotten gains. It's drug money, i.e., money that was legitimately earned by people selling drugs to people that wanted to buy drugs. But of course, that's not legal under our silly drug laws. So they have the pretext that they're trying to stop drug abuse by stealing the proceeds therefrom. And the same way with any other kind of money laundering argument. What they're doing is they're saying that money which is earned by free exchange between free people is not legitimate if the government says it's not legitimate, and if it happens anyway, we're going to take the proceeds.
And the bad thing, the especially bad thing about this situation is that the FBI didn't the way they wrote their argument, it was so specious that the judge says that this isn't even that. What they wanted to do was basically they ran a laundry list of all money laundering, drug exchange, foreign currency violation, and said all these people are guilty of that. And the judge basically said, no, you want a warrant for a specific crime, you have to spell out for each incident which specific crime these people might be guilty of to execute the search warrant. You can't just say they could be listed, they could be or are guilty of every crime from A to Z, and then not take all their stuff and not prove it and keep it. And that's what the government does over and over again. And they take cash off of people on the bus, who are using it to drive somewhere to buy a car, and then bargain with you to give you back part of it. It's just crazy. And until asset forfeiture is eliminated and qualified immunity is tweaked or eliminated, this stuff's going to go on.
It's nothing more than the sheriff of Nottingham, extorting and ripping off the peasants. There's no change. About 1,000 years, still the same old racket.
Yeah. Well, I think if they're going to act like the stooges of the sheriff of Nottingham, they should at least wear tights. I think they should be required to wear tights if you're going to be if you're going to be one of Sheriff of Nottingham's evil men. At least walk around looking like the fool that you would be convicted of being if our courts looked at thieves that work for the government as the same as they look for thieves of any other sort. If I were to walk into a bank and say, this person who's a director of corporation XYZ sold me a car that was a lemon, and take a crowbar to the box and take the money out, I'd be in prison. And for trying to get even. And these people aren't even doing that. They're basically just seizing stuff.
Yeah, the assertion that simply because they're using a private safety deposit service makes them a guilty criminal.
And this is something that the Congress could very easily and in one fell swoop cure by making all victimless crimes not crimes anymore, and by ending unequivocally civil asset forfeiture, whether it's your safety deposit box or whether your car is cleaned out on a traffic stop.
I would personally like to see agents of the government start being held accountable when they violate constitutional and human rights.
Yeah.
One way or another.
Oh yeah,
exactly
that would add a little bit of oomph to it, and there's a word for that too, the name of which is escaping.
And talk about escaping. We are out of time. Thank you for joining us this week. Me and Richard and Team Counterpoint here want to make you all hope you all are doing well. Please remember to love everybody and have a good evening.
Have a good one.
Thank you very much for having me on the show, James.